Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Morgan's LGBTQ plus Friday evening, a celebration of Pride Month, of exhibitions at the Morgan. We continue afterwards in the rest of the institution, which will remain open and is open to the public tonight to really both celebrate our exhibitions, to celebrate the new garden, and to celebrate Pride. I'm Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library Museum. I'm delighted we're a smallish but select group, and we have two very interesting talks ahead of us. I'm delighted you're here. To remind, on view this evening in our galleries are J. Pierpont Morgan's library, Building the Bookman's Paradise, an exhibition that talks about how the Morgan started as an institution. 100 years of James Joyce's Ulysses, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses in June 1922, and a wonderful gift of Ulysses material to the Morgan from Sean and Mary Kelly. And then, of course, two exhibitions that are going to be explored this evening: Writing a Chrysanthemum, the Drawings of Rick Barton, and Please Send to Real Life, Ray Johnson, Photographs. In his New Yorker review of the Ulysses exhibition, Hilton Als notes that James Joyce was financially and emotionally supported by queer women who believed in his genius. He writes, quote, "What better way to commemorate Gay Pride Month than to celebrate Joyce's friendship with remarkable gay women whose own brilliance included recognizing his." So please, if you can't see them all tonight, please do come back and see our exhibitions over the next couple of months. We're very pleased that historian Gary Kamiya has joined us from the Bay Area to talk about the LGBTQ scene in San Francisco in the period from 1930 to 1960. And this will place Rick Barton's work in perspective. And we're also pleased that Caitlin Haskell, curator of modern and contemporary art from the Art Institute of Chicago, is here to talk with Joel Smith, Richard L. Menschel Curator from the Morgan, organizer of the exhibition and the publication Send to Real Life, about Ray Johnson's career in photography. I'm now handing over to Rachel Federman, our associate curator of modern and contemporary drawings, who organized our Rick Barton exhibition, edited the catalog, wrote a very beautiful essay in it, and she will introduce our first speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Colin. I'm delighted to introduce author, journalist, and historian Gary Kamiya. He is the author of the best-selling books Cool Gray City of Love, 49 Views of San Francisco, and Spirits of San Francisco, Voyages Through the Unknown City, with artist Paul Madonna. His award-winning history column, Portals of the Past, has appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle since 2013. He was a co-founder and longtime executive editor of Salon.com and the former executive editor of San Francisco Magazine. Today, he will be talking about Rick Barton in the context of the storied Black Cat Cafe and the San Francisco Underground more broadly. Please join me in welcoming Gary Kamiya.
No, thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, and of course to the Morgan Library for inviting me to speak on this extraordinary artist. I confess that, like Rachel herself, I had never heard of Rick Barton. And in fact, very few people have ever heard of Rick Barton. He's one of these remarkable treasures who just fell through the cracks. He's, really deserves to be better known, and I'm so delighted that the Morgan is making him better known. And there's actually was one gentleman that I learned about, an older artist in San Francisco who knew Rick Barton and hung out with him, a 79-year-old artist named Joe Zigay. And I had several long chats with Joe, and I'll sort of recount those conversations at the end of my talk. But suffice it to say for now, before we get to that, that Rick Barton was truly a sui generis artist and a sui generis human being. And this is not unusual for the scene that Rick Barton hung out in, and which was the late 1950s through the early to mid 1960s in North Beach and in the rougher, more urban center of transgressive culture and sexuality, the Tenderloin. There were a lot of people like Rick Barton, enough people that, they broke the mold when they made them. And so in these remarks, I'm just going to sketch quickly a history of the San Francisco Demi-monde. So San Francisco was actually a wide open town and a place that did not adhere to conventional rules even before the gold rush. Even when it was called Yerba Buena, under Mexican rule, it was a very odd place. It was the end of the world. It was one of the hardest places to get to until the first wagon trains crossed the Sierras. It was very arduous to get there. And it was a little sleepy hamlet. It had been a forgotten outpost of Spain and an even more forgotten outpost under Mexico. And so what you ended up having is these Spanish land grantees who then fancied themselves Dons. They were former low-ranking soldiers in the Mexican army, and then New England sea captains and other rolling stones that ended up at the end of the continent, and they intermarried. So an early writer called San Francisco a half-breed babe. So it was the countercultural marriages were the norm. And there was also a prodigious amount of drinking that went on in early Yerba Buena. So this sort of set the stage for what was to unfurl with the incredible cataclysm that followed shortly after the American conquest of California and the Mexican-American War, the discovery of gold in 1848. And that just led to this, massive, one historian said it was as if they tilted the continent and everything slid to the left. And so this already eccentric, it was described by Bernard DeVoto as a place filled with dream-drugged escapists. This kind of lotus eater land was suddenly filled with tens of thousands of mostly nice, innocent young men from the East Coast and all over the world who were suddenly free from East Coast notions of propriety and could do whatever they wanted to. And they indulged in vices they would never have thought of doing back home. They drank, they gambled, they whored. And it was a truly radically egalitarian. You'd have judges digging ditches in Portsmouth Square right next to common laborers because it was all about what you could do to make a living, and you had to live by your wits. So it began extremely it was an offbeat place, an off-kilter place from the beginning. And then its first vice districts appeared, interestingly, in exactly the same area that Rick Barton and other members of the San Francisco Demi-monde were to end up living, a neighborhood I also live in, the neighborhood of North Beach, a very legendary neighborhood in San Francisco. And the very first vice district there was called Chile Town. It was mostly inhabited by Chilean prostitutes. And it was then, they were then replaced by Australian ne'er-do-wells. They were known as the Sydney Ducks, and it became known as Sydney Town. And these were quite raunchy waterfront areas with lots of brothels and drunken low dives. And then, following those two, after those were cleaned up by the Committee of Vigilance, which threw their members out, they were replaced by the most famous vice district, one of the most famous vice districts in North America, the Barbary Coast. All of these are right on the southern edge of North Beach, centered around Pacific Street. And this then became the center of the city's Bohemia. This became the center of the city's Demi-monde. And this is partly a coincidence, a geographical coincidence, but not entirely. It's been said that Bohemians require only three things: cheap rent, cheap food and drink and alcohol, and cheap available sex. And all of those ingredients were on the menu in North Beach from the beginning. So the Barbary Coast was famous for its depravity. Women were having sex with animals. There was a man named Dirty Tom McAleer who would eat literally anything you would give him for a small coin. So there was a lot of just, really debased behavior, but there was also, early on, some really interesting cutting-edge cultural productions, if you will. Some of the word jazz first appears in the San Francisco publication. Obviously, San Francisco did not invent jazz, but there were major early jazz music, including Jelly Roll Morton visited there, and some cutting-edge dances that were deemed so scandalous that the turkey trot was one of them. The turkey trot was ruled so licentious that the Vatican actually issued a proclamation saying that it was immoral and should not be performed, which of course caused its popularity to soar. And the places where these dances took place, the most famous of them, the So Different Club on Pacific, was run by two African-American railroad porters, and it was what was known as a black and tan club. So there was a lot of sort of semi-accepted race mixing going on, as well as this great music with pianists. They were like congueros. They played 12 hours and just pounding the keys. So this was all sort of semi-tolerated by the city officials. And San Francisco has always had a rather schizophrenic attitude towards vice. From the beginning, there was this kind of what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas quality to San Francisco. And there was even one mayor, McCarthy, who came up with a slogan, "San Francisco is the Paris of the West." So there was this sort of marketing of San Francisco as a sinful place. But at the same time, there were periodic outbursts of moral zeal and moral reform, and that kind of push-pull took place throughout the city's history, and we'll see it when we turn to the more modern manifestations of the city's bohemian scene. Now, there was a wonderful premonition of San Francisco's center as a major mecca for gay culture that took place as early as 1882. And it's quite ironic and sort of covered, but it involved the visit to San Francisco of none other than Oscar Wilde. As a young man, you may recall that Oscar Wilde, when he went on this lecture tour to the United States, was part of the aesthetic movement. So he wore this exaggerated, dandified outfit with an enormous sunflower, which he would ostentatiously sniff, and his lectures were full of expressions like, "It's too." And he appeared in San Francisco, and he was derided by some of the press. Some of them were a little more favorable. Ambrose Bierce really took him apart. But the funny part was there was this old club that goes back almost to Gold Rush days called the Bohemian Club, which today is about the farthest thing from a Bohemia imaginable. It's like a club for the likes of Henry Kissinger to get naked and pee in the woods. But they do bring in some artists to write their voluminous plays that they're always putting on. But it's captains of industry. But it started out, it really was a lot of artists. So they decided they were going to basically take the piss out of this effete pansy. They didn't directly state that he was homosexual, but there was this sort of implication that he was very fey and very ridiculous, and they were going to make fun of him. So they invited him over to the Bohemian Club rooms, and the plan was to get him involved in a nice discussion and get him completely drunk. So they began pouring copious shots of whiskey. Now, but they made one mistake. in addition to being extremely aesthetic and brilliant and very, sensitive, Oscar Wilde was a 200-pound beefy Irishman who'd probably been absorbing Irish whiskey when these San Franciscans were still on their mother's milk. So he just was calling for drinks, and the rootin' tootin' tough guys began to reel, and by the end of the evening, they had all been rendered hors de combat and were under the table, literally, while Oscar Wilde was discoursing volubly and carrying on. So it's a wonderful sort of curtain raiser for San Francisco's later status in terms of the gay artistic world, even though, of course, Oscar Wilde was not out at that time, and he would only be outed in the most tragic and destructive possible way. But so returning to the gay scene, it was pretty much like everywhere. There was no open gay scene in San Francisco. And you'll read, people say, oh, well, that, they were that bachelor and his good friend and this woman and her good friend, but they never, nothing was ever said explicitly. But in the 1930s, that began to change in the social, in the bar settings. The first lesbian bar opened in North Beach in 1934. It was called Mona's, and I was completely delighted to discover, and it's not very well known that it was there, that it actually opened only half a block from where I live. So I felt this great connection with this sort of founding, event in the gay history of San Francisco. And at about the same time, a number of gay and lesbian bars began to open in the Tenderloin, which, as I mentioned, is a rougher, more urban, grittier part of San Francisco. Now, at the same time that these gay scenes were beginning to develop in these cafes and bars in North Beach and the Tenderloin, there was a literary and artistic scene, especially in North Beach, that was flourishing and had been flourishing from a really long time, and it was centered around two remarkable buildings. One of them, the Black Cat, that we've heard a little bit about, and that Rick Barton hung out in and actually depicted in some of his drawings. The other building is probably the great tragic loss of architectural and historical preservation in San Francisco. It's a building called the Montgomery Block. They used to call buildings blocks for some reason, I guess because it took up an entire block. And it was built in 1853. It was a big, massive granite four-story pile. It was renowned as the most imposing building west of the Mississippi. And it was the address. It was like where you wanted to be if you were a lawyer or a businessman. And it continued, and it was filled with extraordinary people. For example, believe it or not, Mark Twain actually met a San Francisco fireman named Tom Sawyer in the sauna of the Montgomery Block. And Ambrose Bierce and George Sterling and the artist Sadakichi Hartman, the list goes on and on. George Sterling, the king of Bohemia, they all hung out in this building, which as time went on and moved into the 20th century began to fall on hard times and became sort of the world's most sublime, if run down, SRO. Most of its rooms didn't have kitchens or even bathrooms, but it was filled with artists and writers. And in the 1930s, under the federal art project of the Works Project Administration, there were no less than 75 artists and writers living in the Montgomery Block. This building, by the way, just for those of you that at least know this silhouette of the San Francisco skyline, it was torn down tragically in 1959 for a parking lot, but then on the site of that parking lot was erected the Transamerica Pyramid. So that's where it stood, which is right on the edge of North Beach. It's between North Beach and the financial district. So the artist colony that grew up around that area, there were a lot of painters. A lot of artists hung out in the Montgomery Block. In the early 20th century, there was a group called Les Jeunes who put out, that was Gillette Burgess and his cohorts who put out these very avant-garde magazines. And then in the 30s, people like Maynard Dixon, the well-known artist who was married to Dorothea Lange, hung out there. Dorothea Lange lived a block away in the 700 block of Montgomery Street, right next to the Black Cat. And this block actually, weirdly, became written up in the San Francisco papers in the 1930s as San Francisco's artists' colony. So hard as it is to believe, as recently as the 1930s, you could have an artists' colony that had an epicenter in one block of San Francisco. And this was the same block between the Black Cat and the Monkey Block. The Montgomery Block was called the Monkey Block because of the antics of its inhabitants. But then right up the street was Izzy Gomez's famous cafe, which featured in William Saroyan's play, The Time of Your Life. So this is the 30s, and the journalists reported that there were long-haired bohemians and young painters and socialistic newspapermen arguing about art and politics and drinking. Now, right across the street from the Monkey Block was the most significant bar. There's a very fine PhD dissertation that I think has been published by a writer named Stephen Duncan called The Rebel Cafe. And the Black Cat was pretty much the quintessential rebel cafe. It was a place where Rick Barton hung out. And it had had an earlier life in the Tenderloin. Then it moved to 710 Montgomery Street, where it stands to this day, where the building stands. And it opened in 1933. It was opened run by a guy named Carl Haberkern. It wasn't particularly gay at first, but Haberkern had what was described as a good-natured indifference to the sexual preferences of his patrons, and this kind of live and let live tolerant attitude was to be typical of many of the cafes and bars, especially in North Beach and in the Tenderloin going forward. And this tolerant atmosphere created by Haberkern attracted many gay writers and artists, including the poet Elsa Gidlow, along with the gay novelist Clarkson Crane and his partner Clyde Evans. It was recognized as becoming more gay fairly early. The Examiner ran a joke about how the phone number of the Black Cat was quite close to that of the Chamber of Commerce. And people would get the numbers wrong and ask for the Chamber of Commerce and complain that they got this outrageously effeminate voice on the phone. So but it wasn't yet a fully gay scene. But it was interesting, and it became more and more gay as time went on. And it was the haunt of many major countercultural figures of the 1930s through the 1950s, of whom the most important was a poet, writer, and intellectual who doesn't get quite as much recognition probably as he deserves for his centrality, especially for bringing together the left, the literary scene, and with lots of connections to the homosexual scene, as it was called at the time, the writer and critic Kenneth Rexroth. Rexroth was a father figure to a big circle of avant-garde writers and artists, and some of whom were gay, including the poet Robert Duncan and Allen Ginsberg. And by the 1930s, the Black Cat became Rexroth's regular spot. And he spearheaded a tradition in North Beach where radical politics and avant-garde and personal literary notions of liberation came together. And that tradition, there's actually a through line that even runs up to today that was continued by the fine poet and committed radical Jack Hirschman, who just sadly died of COVID last year and who I was fortunate enough to become friends with. So that tradition has continued in North Beach. The Black Cat atmosphere was not only literary and radical, but it was very sodden, and there was a lot of consumption of heavy booze. In fact, one wag described its regulars. They sang, "Not so much writers with drinking problems as drinkers with writing problems," which actually sums up a fairly significant amount of the Demi-monde. Luckily, Rick Barton, was the real thing. And anyway, Haberkern sold this to a guy named Saul Stuman in the 1940s. Stuman was a straight man, Holocaust survivor. The place was becoming more and more gay. It was a fascinating mixture of longshoremen, of some streetwalkers, of gays, of intellectuals, artists, writers, this really unique combination because it was relatively close to the waterfront and in a pretty rough neighborhood. And the police began to harass the gays that that patronized the Black Cat. Now, Stuman, as I say, was a straight man. He didn't have any particular agenda, but he just thought it was wrong that the police were hassling his gay clients, so he filed a lawsuit because they were basically being hassled simply because they were gay. They were congregating, they were openly homosexual, and the police would run them in. Stuman filed a lawsuit that went all the way to the California Supreme Court in 1951, and to everyone's surprise, Stuman won the case. And the California landmark case said that you couldn't harass or arrest people simply for being gay and being in public. It wasn't a crime to be gay in public. So that was a big victory. That had never actually been established legally. However, there was a poison pill in the ruling, which was, the little addendum was, as long as they do not engage in immoral or illegal behavior. And this allowed the police and then the Alcoholic Beverage Board of Control to say, oh, well, what's immoral behavior? That was not defined, and then that got defined to be such a low bar that, like, putting your hand on somebody's knee or saying, do you want to go home with me, or anything like that was grounds for arrest, because that was immoral behavior. So this led to an ongoing crackdown that began 3 or 4 years after the Supreme Court ruling, after the San Francisco Examiner magazine, a newspaper, the Hearst newspaper, launched a morality crusade in which they said, we've got to clean up these homosexuals before this town becomes the complete center for deviates. Deviant was the favorite word used for gays. Not deviant, but deviates, deviation from the mean. And and Mayor George Christopher, who was fairly conservative and he wanted to win votes on the morality crusade, enlisted the Alcoholic Beverage Control Board and the police, and they began to engage in entrapment. And they began to harass the Black Cat. But at the same time, while this was going on, the event took place in the Black Cat that really put it on the map in terms of gay history, really, in the US, which was the appearance and the flourishing of this remarkable figure named Jose Sarria, who was a openly gay man who did a gay shtick that went on, especially on Sunday afternoons, for the Sunday afternoon brunch at the Black Cat, where he would greet patrons as they came in with this kind of knowing thing about, well, we know you're gay. The assumption was everyone's gay who's here. And he would do sort of a Mort Saul-like thing where he'd read the paper with everything with a gay twist. He was outrageously campy. He would literally lead the patrons, running around the neighborhood. He dressed outrageously in drag. He would conclude the festivities by singing "God Save the Queen" with the lyrics changed to "God Save Us Nelly Queens." And so he was this, there's a wonderful, one of the slides you may have noticed is a great photo that shows, him in his full empress, complete diva mode with just this uproarious group of laughing patrons, some of whom were straight, some of whom were gay, and had come down to see him. So he really, the bar, after Jose Sarria got started, which was in the early 50s, it became more and more gay. And then, of course, the harassment got stronger and stronger as it went on. Now, at the same time, right at this time, the Beat movement explodes. So, as you probably remember, the seminal event of that was Allen Ginsberg's reading of Howl at the Six Gallery, which was a little bit across town, although they then returned to celebrate the incredible success of that reading in North Beach. That took place in 1955, and then to the good fortune of Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg, the police decided to seize it and charge the owners, both Ferlinghetti and one of his bookstore managers, and Ginsberg himself, with obscenity. This made Howl world famous, put City Lights books on the map, and changed American literary history. It was the most fortunate, idiotic, obscenity charge ever brought. But that brought in the beats. Then exploded onto the scene. The people were making the pilgrimage and trying to emulate on the road, coming across from New York to San Francisco, and then the holy trinity of beat rebel cafes opened in North Beach, which was the Place, the Coffee Gallery, and the wonderfully named Coexistence Bagel Shop. Rick Barton actually has a drawing both in from the Black Cat and the Place, and the Coexistence Bagel Shop, and he was associated with the Coffee Gallery. So all of these were on his haunts, and there were a lot of really deliriously creative things that went on in these places. The Place featured a night called Blabbermouth Night, in which everyone was invited to literally say anything they wanted to about anything, and there was this kind of little lectern, and they would just get up and start riffing, and and then of course they weren't supposed to say the F word, and then they would always say it, and so they were always trying to push the police to the edge, and in fact. The police went over the edge, because we talked earlier about the push-pull of the city's tolerance, sort of mingled tolerance and repression. And in 1957, some conservative, possibly Italian or Irish, the neighborhood was still very Italian at that time, complained about these do-nothing long-haired loafers that were coming into the neighborhood. And the police, in response, instituted what was called the Beat Patrol, which was two policemen who took it upon themselves to just harass these no-good countercultural loafers. And they would stand in front of the holy trinity of these bars and harass people for anything. There was one episode where a young woman from Berkeley, her sandal strap had broken, and she was trying to go into the Coexistence Bagel Shop at the corner of Grant and Green, and this one particularly loathsome cop, whose name was Officer Bigorani, known as Bigowini in some circles in North Beach, came up to her and said, where's your identification? And she said, I don't have any, and then he basically, she said, no cop is going to tell me what to do, when she tried to go into the place, and then he arrested her for talking back to him. In those days, you could be there was this catch-all charge of loitering that could be used promiscuously, basically, for anybody who talked back to the police or that the police didn't like. So she was hauled off to jail. And that was the beginning of what proved to be Bigorani and his partner's 2-year anti-beat crusade, of which the most the target that Bigorani really loved to go after was this brilliant, very obstreperous, very difficult, in certain elements resembled Rick Barton in some ways, a really brilliant poet named Bob Kaufman. And Bigorani was constantly after Kaufman, and Kaufman was so obstreperous that he gave Bigorani, ample reason to, hassle him. One time, for example, Bob Kaufman ran into the laundromat that's still there on Upper Grant and threw red dye into all of the washing machines, saying he just wanted to make all the clothes red. And according to another observer of the beat scene, Bigorani took Kaufman and just said he beat the shit out of him. So there was a lot of sort of immediate corporal violence was sometimes used by the cops. And there was the most famous episode was Kaufman and another poet named Bill Margolis wrote poems that were, they did some especially egregious action of Bigorani, and so they wrote these poems. I think that Kaufman's compared him to Hitler, and it was a pretty heavy-handed poem. It began something like, one day Adolf Hitler had nothing to do. Eva was busy, he'd killed all the Jews, so he decided to go hassle some beatniks. But that was nothing compared to Margolis's poem, which basically compared Bigorani to the Antichrist. And it concluded with something like, may their fetid skulls burst through their rotting corpses. And, and they hung it on the walls of the Coffee Gallery. And Bigorani came and saw these poems, and he tore them down. And then later he told a Chronicle reporter, well, they hurt my feelings. I mean, I do have feelings, you know. And the poets and the ACLU and other supporters realized that this was a golden First Amendment case. And so they went walking down Grant Avenue, putting the poems up and looking for police to tear them down. And Kaufman hilariously said, isn't that the way? You can never find a policeman when you want one. But they eventually prevailed. Even the chief of police realized that Bigorani's statement that it hurt his feelings was not a strong legal argument. Bigorani eventually became completely humiliated. Yeah. And so he was, you know, finally transferred off the force and humiliated. But the beat movement ran out of steam in the early 60s. It was killed by commercialization and police harassment, and just because its time had run out. All of these places, the Place, the Coffee Gallery, and the Coexistence Bagel Shop, they all closed in 1960. And the Black Cat, Saul Stuman's long, noble struggle to keep it alive, finally ended with in 1963, he had to give up, and there was an enormous party. I know the architect who now still is in that Canessa building, and he recalls gay men filling the alleys, drinking soft drinks at 6 a.m., just partying all night to commemorate the end of the Black Cat. But the happy news is that even by 61, the tide of official anti-gay bigotry was turning in San Francisco. That was the year that Jose Sarria ran for supervisor and won a respectable 7,000 votes. So that was an epochal moment. And there was an egregious anti-gay raid at a club called the Tay Bush Club in 61 that led a Chronicle columnist, Herb Cain, who had enormous power, to mock the official hypocrisy, saying, oh, it's fine if you're a society gay, because he knew all the secrets. So that's fine. You just have to be society, but if you're not, no, you have to go down. So, and then there was another egregious anti-gay raid at the California Hall on New Year's Day 65, and that caused such a backlash that no such raid was ever attempted again. And gay organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis started, and San Francisco was on its way to becoming the mecca of gay culture and liberation that it became and remains to this day. So just in conclusion, I just want to return from this general history of the Demi-monde to Rick Barton. And now in Dave Nelson, he writes under the pen name of Dave Archer, in his memoir that Rachel cites in her monograph, he comes across as really difficult, really brilliant, a little crazy, really obsessive. When I talked to Joe Zigay, he recalled him a little differently, but Zigay strayed. He was never in an erotic relationship with him, and he wasn't as close as Nelson was. But it's interesting, Zigay recalls him really as just being an obsessive artist. And so he said, Rick Barton was just a regular guy like us. He wasn't overtly gay. He didn't drink that much, and I was underage, but we would smoke weed. We hung out in North Beach at the Elixir and other places. We ate at Lowy Goey's in Chinatown. Barton also, Zigay remembers going with Rick Barton to one of the coast missions. In the exhibition, there's some extraordinary line drawings of Barton's of missions and churches in Barcelona and in Mexico. And Zigay went down, they spent the night, stayed at a hotel, and the next day, Barton just sat in the square of the cathedral drawing it, wearing his beret. And he said he'd just be drawing all the time. He would just sit there and bullshit and tell stories about China and draw. He told me that he went native in China. There was a big Chinese influence in his art, pen and ink, mostly with a fine brush. He got this little yatate, it looked like a little pipe, and he would just sit there with his accordion book, and he would draw every leaf in the tree. He did a couple of drawings of me. He would start with a fingernail. He had the patience to just sit there for hours. He would work all the time. He'd start going to bed, and then he'd get up and start drawing again. He'd make these accordion books where the pages fold out, Japanese folding books with all these heads and buildings and everything he saw that day. Zigay recalls one story that's very sort of Demi-monde. One day, Zigay took peyote. In the middle of the night, he was trying to get out to his parents' house way out in the avenues. He was completely confused. He didn't know where he was. on Market Street, and who should come down the street but Rick Barton, who came up and said, "Hey, Joe, how you doing?" And he sort of saved him, and they ended up going on some weird excursion to the Haight, and that was, you know, he said he felt a lot better. They used to go up to the hotel where Barton was staying by the Embarcadero and smoke weed, and he says, "We left the weed in a tube of paint." The scene, he remembers the North Beach scene. It was like, it was all mixed up. It was so gay. There was Miss Smith's Tea Room and all these other places. It was a mix of everything. Gays, straights, Italians, Chinese, and then it had the Black Cat nearby. He talked about getting hassled by the police. The well-known artist Bob Levine, who painted a very famous, it's quite an important picture in the history of gay painting. It's of Peter Orlovsky, who became Allen Ginsberg's lover. Bob Levine actually was on the street one day when Joe got arrested in front of the Coexistence Bagel Shop because he was stoned and sitting on the ground. And Levine came over and tried to help him, and they arrested him too. Said they just arrest you for anything that hassle you. Anyway, he just concluded by saying, you know, Barton, I really liked the guy. He never hit on me or anything like that. I think the last time I saw him was in the Savoy Tivoli on Grant Avenue. He was carrying on, crazy or drunk. "Hey, Ziggy, come and give me a kiss." I didn't want to be around him like that. I'm sorry I didn't talk to him. But the people who knew him respected him. A lot of crazies hung out with him, but he could manipulate them. I always found him interesting. I never had any problems with him. He was together, I thought so. He had his problems, sure. He knew all about art. He always listened to classical music. I learned a lot just being around him. So in his memoir, Dave Nelson talks about how one night in the coffee gallery, unable to sell his art or gain any real recognition, Rick Barton, in despair, threw his drawings into the air. And Nelson concludes, "I hope with all my heart that the drawings the master threw in the air that night in the coffee gallery bar never really fell back to the floor to be trod underfoot, but kept rising higher and higher until they joined Tibetan clouds somewhere." And that's as good a place as any to bid farewell to the San Francisco Demi-monde and one of its most illustrious and happily no longer forgotten members, Rick Barton. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Joel Smith, the Richard L. Menschel Curator at the Morgan, and I'm pleased to be here tonight to discuss Ray Johnson and photography with Caitlin Haskell. As Gary C. and Francis Comer Curator, Modern and Contemporary Art, and Director of Ray Johnson Collections and Research at the Art Institute of Chicago, Caitlin co-organized last year's definitive survey, Ray Johnson Care Of. Tonight, Caitlin really brings the deep knowledge of the artist's work as a whole, while I bring up close-up familiarity with the long unseen photographs that form the basis of the exhibition upstairs. I hope that simply seeing the show will clarify anything we mentioned tonight that is mysterious at first blush, but here briefly is what you need to know. Ray Johnson, best known as a collage artist who liked to send his art to viewers through the Postal Service, took up photography near the end of his life in his mid-60s. He used point-and-shoot, throwaway cameras exclusively. After 3 years in which he used 137 of those cameras, Johnson jumped from a bridge in Sag Harbor, about an hour and a half east of where he lived. His suicide in January of 1995 is often described as his final performance. The photographs, still in the envelopes from the developer's shop, were among the thousands of works he left on shelves and in boxes throughout the rooms of his house in Locust Valley, Long Island. Now, Caitlin is going to go first and really deliver the substance of what we're going to learn about tonight, walking us through some of the ways in which the photographs resonate in the broader context of Ray Johnson's art, and specifically suggesting some key words for thinking about him and how his art works. After we converse our way through Caitlin's points, there's some passages in the first notebook entries I made about the photographs when I first saw them in fall of 2019 that I'd like to bounce off of her and sort of get her response to. So please, Caitlin.
Excellent. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you this evening and to have had a chance to see your exhibition, Joel. And I think we've shared this wonderful experience separately but concurrently of working on Ray Johnson over the past few years and really being, I don't know, there's a closeness to thought that comes out reading Ray's letters, looking at his images, and I've enjoyed it. And you know, we couldn't have really picked more different angles to approach Ray Johnson. You looking at the very last years of his life and through a particular medium. My lens onto Ray Johnson has been through a particular, his archivist, a particular friend that he met in 1956 who collected his work. He knew Ray Johnson, of course, through the end of his life. And then after Ray Johnson's suicide in 1995, he began the process of going through all of his correspondence and actually organizing it and categorizing it in chronological order and kind of creating this record of Ray's life. And so what we'll see in the images that come out are really some through lines, I think, that connect what I've been seeing in Ray Johnson, you know, looking mostly at his work of the 1950s, some of his work of the 1960s, and strangely enough, it comes out in his photographic practice of the last 2 years of his life. And I'm going to just, there we go. So you were saying we will talk about some key words, key concepts, and one of those would be correspondence. And one of my favorite pieces in your exhibition displayed in a vitrine is a letter that Ray Johnson wrote to a woman by the name of Frances X. Profumo. Frances X. Profumo was at Black Mountain College when Ray was there. He attended the school from 1945 to 1948. Frances was not a student. She was actually one of the administrators, but she and Ray became friendly, and afterwards, when Ray was living in New York, he would send her mail. And what you see in this lovely mailing are things that I would say that reminded Ray of his friend Frances X. Profumo. He, was going through his life, looking through magazines, anything that he would see that brought Frances to mind, he would put in an envelope and send to her. So when she opened this up, certainly the X's on the sock would have reminded her, of course, of her notable middle initial. This you get X, the X's in the ties of the photographic imagery of the school uniforms they look like, and this idea of Taoist boxes. So correspondence, of course, in one sense is this practice of writing, of corresponding with each other, but there's also a sense of ideas corresponding and what Ray sees, sort of how his mind is working, and what corresponds from his life to this person who's elsewhere. And then for us as historians working through this material now, there's often a sort of a secondary type of correspondence. So looking at this mailing from around 1955, I would imagine, it brought to mind for me, there we go, a collage at the Art Institute's collection, Taoist Toast. And of course, we have an example of photography here, this image of Arthur Rimbaud, which has been collaged using a beautiful type of red metallic thread that Ray was fond of using to create collages at this time. Ray was also working as a commercial book designer, and around the time that he made this collage, he designed the very famous cover of Rimbaud's Illuminations for New Directions paper books. So you can see sort of that commercial practice coming into his collage practice. At the time Ray made these collages sometimes were called Taoist collages. That now they're better known as modicos. And modicos is a made-up word. It's an anagram of osmotic, which was a word that was just found at random in a dictionary, But there is sort of a sense of osmosis or collages, most of them about the size, handheld. You could send them. They were intended to be dispersed through the mail, and they were supposed to circulate, right? Today, if you see modicos, and I should say there aren't so many of them, because the modicos that Ray himself had, he would chop up and put into subsequent collages. But if you happen to see some that he sent to others, there is a sense that they were supposed to be circulating through the world. Ray took photographs of his modicos, and what we see in documents like this is that these collages were actually intended to be anything but framed artworks to be presented in a gallery or a museum context. He thought of them as things that were, to use your phrase, part of real life. And he would set them up almost like paper dolls. And interestingly, he would go out with friends, notably the art historian Susie Gablick, but would also have another mutual friend, Elizabeth Novick, taking photographs of them, setting up the modicos, sometimes draping modicos on each other, and simply sort of engaging them in an urban context. And one wonders what was the motivation to photograph these events? Why bring Elizabeth Novick into this? And I think it's because it was such a sort of private moment. It wasn't something that was going to be duplicated or replicated. It was something that was just happening among friends, much like his correspondence art. One person is receiving it. But this could allow for documentation and for future audiences. And very interestingly, in Joel's exhibition, we see that in the last years of his life, Ray started photographing these photographs of his performances with modicos. And we can talk a little bit more about why he might have been doing that. But from my perspective, it's interesting to see this because of Johnson's interest in always reusing his work. Every artwork becomes the potential material for a future work of art. And there's even a little bit of a formal resemblance here to some of his most dense collages, where he would create sort of relief tesserae from early modicos. But there's a collage aesthetic here, I would say, in the presentation of these 1950s modicos together.
From my perspective, too, there's simply the fact that he's photographing photographs. That here, very, very early, January of 1992, just about the beginning of the story that's told by the photographs in the exhibition, he's looking back and saying, he's identifying a thread in his work that is photographic, and he photographs of his work and also puts them in the context of other photographs, so that these crowds of modicos he pairs in a photograph with a photograph by Ouija of Coney Island on the 4th of July, filled with a crowd. And so you see literalized this idea that these are performers, or they're play dolls, or they're people living in the world through that comparison, through that correspondence.
Excellent. So I'll move on through a few more images. This is actually an installation view of Ray Johnson Care of, the exhibition that we presented at the Art Institute, which just closed in March. And, I believe we've already said, when Ray was creating modicos, they were not intended to be part of, they were actually a real challenge to the understanding of art that was being presented in museums at the time. And so one of the things that my co-curator and I, Jordan Carter, decided was that we wanted to remove all of the backing boards off of the modicos and try to present them in the round. And you can see several of these, have photographic elements. They also have other elements from real life, such as real keys hanging down from them. And they have interesting contours, but behind them you can see a few collages that are still presented framed. And one of my very favorite modicos that we presented in this vitrine is a work that you see in the very foreground. It's a work that goes by the title Island, probably given to Bill Wilson in the mid-1950s, and it's simply an aperture. And so that makes me think about a viewfinding device, which I think is partly what Ray Johnson was doing with his disposable cameras, is looking at the world and sharing the way that he looks at the world with us in a very immediate and kind of democratic way. But you might have noticed in the Modicos vitrine or in the photographs of the performances of the 50s that Modicos have very distinctive shapes. They tend not to be symmetrical, much like the work that you're seeing on the, that would be on your right. And what Ray started doing was making silhouettes of the forms of the Modicos, and you can see them in the collage with James Dean, so those sort of glyphs that you encounter in the foreground of that image. And so Ray was sort of distributing his work, or at least the silhouettes of his work, in design flyers. And this is, again, sort of one of those through lines that connects from the early 1950s to the very end of Johnson's career. But we know the Modicos design flyer, with all of these contours of collages that he made, he distributed this far and wide. We know that reached members of the Gutai movement, for example, in Japan, and that they thought this was a very innovative way of distributing his art, actually, that didn't require galleries and didn't require museums, but was more direct. And this could be, I don't know, a little bit of a stretch, but in the 1970s, Ray starts bringing silhouette into the more social side of his practice. So the correspondence school was conducted via mail, but it was also conducted in person in meetings. And Ray started lists of people with whom he would meet, and then he would draw their silhouettes and then incorporate them in collages, as we see here with Tab Hunter and William Burroughs. And he seems to create an additional vocabulary of Modicos. Joel, in the photographs that you present, some of these silhouette forms seem to be taken from areas of his home, the Pink House, and anyhow, this vocabulary continues.
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to say whether it's a discovery of Johnson's in this late period of his work or it's something that he knew all along. But he realizes it through photography, and that is that through the language of photography, which is the language of vision, you are, as the photographer, that aperture. You are the perceiving element, and you're simply trying to pick up on what the eye actually sees in the world. Yeah. Shadows are a kind of naturally occurring modicos. You know the things in your life, in the world, you're accustomed to thinking of the surfaces of them, but the shadow gives you the modicos version, the uncorporeal version of the reality you're familiar with. And of course, photography doesn't draw any distinction between the two things, and he often plays with that in the most literal sort of way by pairing a thing with its shadow, and this is a great example of that.
So a discovery for me in your exhibition is a recurrence of this idea of the movie star collage. And what you see on the left is a design flyer contemporaneous with the Modicos mailing that we had just seen in the previous slide. You can see it sort of has a mask and a mouth and sort of a talk bubble coming out of the lips. There's a modified version of it that has the Peanut Butter Festival stamp on it. But when Ray Johnson was being included in early exhibitions and histories of pop art, they would typically point to things like this movie star collage and include it as sort of an indication of his interest in celebrity and popular culture. But what you discovered is that later works, like those that you see kind of stacked there, larger scale, which I had known as totems, also have the name, Ray would refer to them as movie star collages. And I'll go to the next slide so that maybe you could talk about some of his ambitions with those.
Right. Johnson writes to the art critic David Burden that he's created 72 movie stars. This is in the summer of 1993, and he lists them by name. What he lists are the names of the celebrity figures that are represented, either with their photographs or with their names on the bunny faces that he puts on these collages. And he says these would stand 45 feet in length as a sort of lineup of dancers if the wind didn't knock them down. And one thing that he's reproducing in a photograph like this, I think, is what is in fact a very momentary, passing, ephemeral possibility, which is seeing all of these movie stars lined up, but which he conceives of as a potential movie project. Whether the movie is ever supposed to really be made, we don't know.
So another through line across Ray Johnson's career is his use of his own likeness. And in the exhibition, you're displaying this plate used to create offset prints. The image that you see, it's a photograph of Ray from around 1963, taken by the photographer Eric Ignatius. And Ray used it very widely. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a recurrence of the Eric Ignatius photograph where he's mashed himself up with Marilyn Monroe. That's her mouth and hair on Ray's face. And then in the 1990s, sort of making a string of the Eric Ignatius images to make it appear like maybe a roll of film. And what's interesting about this, of course, is that Ray would use this as stationery. He would send them out in great number. But always in presenting this work, you're also met with the fact that he himself is absent, right? He's using an image of himself as a surrogate to put himself into places where he would not be going physically, to have conversations that were impossible in person. And
it's also kind of a disturbingly egoless representation of one's likeness. It's not a handsome representation of himself.
I beg to differ.
Well, I mean, it
No.
reminds me of an ID photo.
Oh, yes.
It's absolutely
Very
frontal,
yeah.
a bit awkward, and to use that as the means by which you reach your viewers is just it's a striking
No,
gesture.
you're absolutely right. There's not much artifice. There's this little smirk, and often if he does use it as the stationery for a letter, he'll have the text kind of go around his smile to emphasize the smirk. On the other side of Ray's visibility and his use of his likeness and some of the issues around performance that we've been talking about, it also seemed relevant to bring up the idea of the nothing. And nothing was Ray Johnson's answer to Alan Capro's Happenings. That's one way you could think about it. His first nothing took place at AG Gallery. The second nothing took place at the Maidman Theater. And it was an entirely darkened theater, and we have one photograph of the event made by Bill Wilson. And I think this sort of shows you these opposites, these two sides of a coin. For every amount of visibility that Ray is giving you and putting himself forward, he's also taking that back and preventing you from seeing him. And you have several works that make reference to nothings and sort of later incarnations of nothings in the 90s. So.
Yes. The word nothing or the phenomenon of a photograph that's empty at the center is something that he comes back to again and again.
And then I'd say just a final aspect of Johnson's work that's recurrent and rather defining is its participatory nature. And what we're looking at on the left side is a mailing that was sent to Bill Wilson, and it actually shows the image that you see on the opposite side in color, one of these 4x6 photographic images made with a disposable camera, and there's instruction to Bill to please blow up the above within the red area. Some photographic references of Cartier-Bresson, that should be Peter Galassi, and de Kooning with a Lucky Strike package. And then he offers this instruction for blowing it up at lavish scale, but with parsimony, which I think is a very wonderful aesthetic. Comes out. On the right side, in the next image, also works contemporaneous with the materials in your exhibition, Joel. All of those metal plates from doing the offset printing What you see here are not only design flyers, but also pages of a project carried out between 1963 and 65 called A Book About Death.
And to be precise, this is a photocopy,
Yes,
photocopy enlargement of one of his photographs, photographing these on the surface of his driveway.
Of another reproductive medium, right? So much nesting there. And then actually one of the photographs from the disposable cameras sent to Bill Wilson showing Eva Hesse and the center panel, the star of Enchanted April. This, of course, was sent to Bill Wilson in April, and making modifications of De Chirico's painting, The Philosopher's Conquest, where the artichokes in that metaphysical painting become eyeballs, and riffing on his bunny rabbit heads. So that's what I have as sort of an introduction and maybe some through lines that connect across the exhibitions that we've been working on, topics and words to know for those who are interested in a longer history of Ray Johnson from the 50s to the 90s.
Thank you very much. I'll certainly look at the photographs in a new way, thinking about some of those categories. In conclusion here, I want to read from this notebook in my first attempt to sort of make sense of the photographs when I was first shown them in the fall of 2019. Originally, this exhibition, like Caitlin's exhibition, was to take place a couple of years ago, and we both found ourselves kind of postponed by the pandemic. So we've had some time to reflect on these things a little bit longer than we intended before the shows actually went up. But if I'll go so here's a group of 3 of the photographs, and I wrote, just thinking out loud to myself, this body of photographs as a whole falls under the category of work product. Johnson made these photos, or started them, on his way to making something else, collages in his usual sense. But Johnson's life and work as a whole were about denying the distinction between working and finished work. Everything with him was always in process of going from one state to another, neither one of them definitive. And B, in that spirit, along the way in his engagement with the single-use camera, he clearly did notice that the photograph itself presented a compelling version of his art, which, like photography, is an art of combining things and giving things new contexts and readings and valences, casting a momentary glimpse of an idea into the mind of a viewer by whatever means come to hand, a pun, a juxtaposition, a repetition, a photograph. I'm saying that the photographs seemed to echo to him things that were familiar from his art from past decades. It's kind of the reverse view of what you've been talking about. So call these photographs collages by way of a camera. Some of them are more readily appreciable as finished collages than others are. At this point, before I had edited down to what we were going to include in the book and the show, I was very conscious of just how many photographs he made, some of which are kind of lesser versions of the ones that we ultimately included.
There's an awful lot there, and that's a wonderful sort of initial observation, and I think I can respond to it in a few ways. So one is sort of an expansion of what Ray Johnson's practice was. There was the work that he made for galleries, the framed collages, and that's a very small sliver of what his activity was. And I think for curators and historians like you and I, part of our job is expanding what people know of the work and actually saying that this was all really part of one body of work. It was one sort of life lived, and one. He was really an artist where it truly is all interconnected. And so while there is a quality of, to these photographs of them being, kind of process pieces, you see him sort of thinking through ideas of future works, I absolutely agree that they can be presented in a gallery space now to give a sense of what his, and we're getting close to the end of our time, but to give a sense of what his conception was of his practice, and this was absolutely part of that. And we were talking about this before, but there's this sense of Ray looking through the camera. He does seem to be quite curatorial in these works, and that while at a moment when he's denying any museum curator or gallery curator an opportunity to show his work, he is thinking about how they could be presented together, what are the right contexts, what are ways that could be interesting to show them, and also how they'll enter the historical record.
Thank you. A second point is really just a photographic one. Maybe I'll read that and then my final point. I wrote, the single-use camera comes as close as a camera can come to being a part of the artist's hand. It weighs little more than a roll of film, and it calls for no knowledge or preparation. Johnson made these images by hand, the same way he made other works by hand with an X-Acto blade or pen and ink. Just a very simple point that part of the freedom of these pictures is that it gives him this ideal medium that he simply doesn't have to think about, and he can create an image and then move on without even leaving the real world for the studio. And finally, because I was not working on work of the 1950s, but work that immediately precedes an artist's death and chosen death, I had to ask myself, is there a point at which death enters into this work? Death is everywhere in Johnson's work all the time, as a cosmic joke generally. But suicide is no joke, and it seems to matter to know whether the final chapter of his career is about finality, whether the work and the finality are parts of each other. Are the photographs part of a message left behind in boxes but never sent, in which Ray Johnson planned and contemplated a death for himself that would be as inseparable from his story as death and life are in the stories of James Dean, Natalie Wood, Montgomery Clift? And is there any reason to expect this question to be any more resolvable than all the other questions that Ray Johnson raised in every work he made?
Wow. So, of course, when an artist dies in the way that Ray Johnson does, by suicide, and a suicide that has often been thought of as really continuous of some of his performance practice, I think there is a desire to read his life through these sort of last moments. And for myself, as you're saying, there are references to death when he's a very young man in his work that he's making in the 30s, certainly, and this idea, this engagement with death as a taboo topic in his book about death. And I would also say that in his letters of the 90s, there is a sense that this could be among the last works that he makes, or the last letter he's sending to someone. In interviewing correspondents and friends of Ray Johnson's, many of them felt that they received a final call where he was sort of settling affairs with them and saying goodbye. But I'm with you on this is something for us to find and to puzzle through and give new life, new meaning, and new interpretations. But I don't really see these the photographs as speaking to a final chapter necessarily, or that he would have intended them as such. How do you see them?
Sometimes I feel like it really is a definitively different attitude towards the end. That it's really about the fact that it's imminent. Some of those who knew him well said that they just sort of thought he had holiday blues in that late month. It was December of 1994. The death seems so performed and so constructed that it's hard to imagine it not affecting someone even as extraordinary as Ray Johnson and getting into his work. And I think in those final months, in photographs that are full of images of packages, the packages that he's sending to others and the packages he's receiving from them, and the way that he treats them, in some cases throwing them into the water and photographing them adrift in the water of Long Island Sound, I think you really are seeing a kind of preview.
Yeah, I don't mean to be too romantic or sentimentalizing, but the participatory aspects of Johnson's work, I feel that they do continue on in the histories that we're writing, the shows that we're making, and presenting them to new audiences now and carrying forward whatever correspondences they're making in our own moment.
Well, amen to that. Please see the exhibitions upstairs and also spend some time in the garden. We're very delighted that everybody could be here tonight. Please come back to the Morgan many times. Thank you.